From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead out of the University of Nebraska. Brad Lubben will take a closer look at the commodity title of the 2018 Farm Bill as it's on the verge of becoming law, specifically the modifications in the ARC and the PLC crop payment programs that will likely be of benefit to you producers. Also, K-State's Doug Jardine will reflect on the most prominent diseases in Kansas corn and soybeans this past season, figuring that into you producers' hybrid and variety selections for next year with disease resistance in mind. And K-State's Charlie Lee will look at a new study of Starling consumption of livestock feed out of the bunk, which indicated how those feed losses might be reduced. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
This is Agriculture Today. Welcome once again. The 2018 Farm Bill process is nearing the finish line, ever so close, but not quite there yet. There are still details out now on what appears to be the conference committee result that lends optimism that this bill may be wrapped up before year's end. We'll find out what our guest thinks on that score. He's Brad Lubben, Agricultural Policy Specialist at the University of Nebraska. We speak with him frequently about Farm Bill matters, and everything is pending, Brad. We need to stress that. But it does seem, with the House and Senate Agriculture Committee leadership and the conference committee members now coming to some sort of consensus here, that the Farm Bill may be imminent.
That's right. We have seen an announcement back on last Thursday, November 30th, of an agreement in principle on the Farm Bill. It had to resolve so many different issues in commodity programs and conservation programs and the very big questions over the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, et cetera. But finally, the Big Four, the chairs and the ranking members of both the House and the Senate Ag Committee, had acknowledged that they had reached conclusion on the final issue, which of all things was forestry. Mm-hmm. Maybe the smallest title in the whole Farm Bill, but with the recent dramatic and catastrophic fires in California, it renewed the policy debate over forest management, which got embroiled yet in the Farm Bill as well. That being resolved, we have a apparent agreement in principle. We have some details being let out and announced, although we're waiting on some specific language, and we may in fact see passage here in the coming week.
As you have watched what has been released so far, you've extracted a few finer points that would be of direct interest to agricultural producers. And let's start with the commodity title and the ARC and PLC programs. There have been some mechanical tweaking there.
That's right. Both programs get a bit of a tweak. Clearly, moving into this bill, we heard some discussions about changing the ARC program, specifically the yield data that goes into the calculations of the ARC program. And the shift did happen, it appears, to go from the survey-based data collected by NASS to the crop insurance reported data collected through the Risk Management Agency as a first source. Mind you, that will not solve every gap in data, nor alleviate the year-to-year variability in how those calculations work, but it certainly does respond to producer and interest group requests to change that. More significantly, I would argue, is the ARC program proposes to adopt a Senate provision that creates a trend-adjusted Olympic average yield instead of the current flat average. So imagine our variability year to year, but we tend to be climbing this technology, platform and increasing productivity year over year. Mm-hmm. Well, a simple 5-year Olympic average yield basically takes a flat average of the last 5 years, minus the high and the low. It does not account for that trend, and so it always is lagging current potential. This proposal would make for that 5-year Olympic average yield to be calculated on a trend-adjusted basis, which means that Olympic average that goes into the guarantee really should reflect current technology. That helps out on the ARC guarantee and makes ARC look a little bit stronger than it would have otherwise. On the PLC side of the equation, the big question was a proposal from Chairman Conaway in the House bill to update payment yields specifically for counties affected by drought during the last time that payment yields were updated. Eventually, after some political consideration and avoiding some of the political battle, the decision has effectively been liberalized to the entire country. So payment yield update coming in 2020, not just for drought-stricken counties, but basically for all counties across the country. Those are the tweaks to ARC and PLC. By far the biggest implication for ARC and PLC remains that there will be a new decision. And even here there's a tweak. There is a new decision in 2019 like we had been predicting, but in fact that decision will ultimately become an annual choice starting in 2021. So moving ARC and PLC programs forward, producers will start calculating and thinking about enrollment choices on an annual basis.
And that allows for more nimbleness on the part of a producer to react to market shifts that would affect ARC and PLC and the other influences out there.
Absolutely, it will make a difference. With market prices where they are at now, it's easy to predict in spring of 2019 that a new decision between ARC and PLC would very strongly favor PLC. Given an opportunity to revisit that decision annually starting in 2021, perhaps we would see, if there's market recovery, then maybe there's more of a role, more of an opportunity for ARC enrollment down the road. So an opportunity here to revisit that and not feel locked into a one-time decision.
Some friendly developments for producers out there. Brad, as you well know, payment limitations were part of the dialogue as this bill was being formulated in both chambers, actually. Anything happening there in the end result that would be of note?
What we did look for was Senate language that was proposing to tighten some of the eligibility adjusted gross income rules, as well as the active engagement, labor, and management rules. We saw House proposals to modestly loosen those rules. What we hear out of the final agreement is effectively a form of the House version that would loosen the current rules as they relate to family operations. And specifically, current rules effectively consider parents and children part of a single family operation when they farm together. And that single family operation does not face as strict a management and labor test as a non-family operation does. But when that operation passes on to the next generation, and now it's no longer siblings and parents farming together, it's nieces, nephews, and cousins farming together, the nieces, nephews, and cousins are not specifically family members as per the current rules. This effectively allows that next generation to continue operating as a family operation.
So once more, that would seem to be more accommodating to certain situations out there with farm family operations.
It's clearly accommodating to the continued transfer and transition to a next generation on an existing family operation. It does not make everybody automatically eligible for payments, which was sort of a big overstatement by some of the opponents that said, no, this is an unlimited payment program for extended families. Well, that's not true. But it does effectively allow the next generation to meet the same family test that the current generation has to meet.
All right. Brad, you say that the art of compromise for once was illustrated in the conservation title, and particularly with regard to the Conservation Reserve Program, where a deal was struck to appease as many parties as possible.
It would seem that the CRP is the perfect illustration of compromise here. The current CRP program faces a cap of 24 million acres, which is rather binding given current interest and participation rates. The Senate proposed to raise that cap to 25 million acres, just a small bump in the cap. The House proposed to raise that cap to 29 million acres. Well, if you compromise 25 and 29, you get 27, and that's in fact what's been reported as the new proposed cap. Of course, any expansion in the CRP costs money, and the proposal that both chambers floated to effectively pay for those additional acres was to cut back on the rental rate. And in fact, the legislation says that the maximum rental rate moving forward would be 90% of the county average for those acres signed up in the continuous program, or 85% of the county average for those acres signed up in a general sign-up. Currently, those acres can enroll in or bid up to 100% of the current rental rates going in. This cuts back on the rental rate, saves some money, spreads that money over more acres.
So when you look at that broadly, the CRP is to remain a formidable program, although there have been pieces moved about here, so to say.
Yeah, in the last several years, we've seen general enrollments going downhill as the cap got smaller and as more acres were enrolled under the continuous provisions. Without an increase in the cap, there really was nothing but a continued decline of general enrollments coming ahead. This gives at least some opportunity to maintain the current general enrollments and maybe grow them modestly. But definitely we've shifted the CRP around from what it was just 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. This will help increase some of those opportunities in the program for producers.
So the path ahead, will we likely see an action on the final proposal in both houses before the lame duck session is over, and following then, will White House approval be forthcoming?
You know, all indications at this point are that it is ready now for final passage. There will be some members that feel they have to vote against the final bill based on reforms that did or didn't get included, but it sounds like there is enough support in both the House and the Senate to move this bill forward.
So 2018 Farm Bill for Christmas is a viable possibility.
It certainly looks like it at this point. The expecting an 18 Farm Bill to actually get done in the same calendar year it started, that's quite a Christmas present.
It's a novel idea indeed. And Brad, we appreciate the update right here. Probably we'll be talking again soon about some of the finer points, if you will, as the bill is finally passed in earnest. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Brad Lubben, Agricultural Policy Specialist out of the University of Nebraska. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and you row crop farmers are, of course, thinking ahead now to the 2019 growing season and contemplating what hybrids or varieties you'll be sowing this next spring. And it pays to go back over what happened this past growing season in as far as disease outbreaks. That may well sway your seed selection, one degree or the other, and we'll talk about that now with Doug Jardine, row crop disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Doug, as you would characterize corn and soybean disease this past year, heavier than normal, lighter than normal, somewhere in the middle? What?
Well, Eric, there's an old saying that every year is different, but I think 2018 was more different than any of the other years. We had a really good start to the season. People got the crops in the ground pretty much on time for the most part. Saw very little seedling blight in soybeans compared to many other years. Corn, we rarely see any planting time problems, so that's always a good thing. And then, in a large area of the state, it quit raining. For like a really long time. So that started to cause some problems. I know in many areas here in the Manhattan area and extending in lots of different directions, it was so dry that the corn plants didn't even set ears. A lot of our dryland corn was, simply chopped or baled or whatever. And soybeans were hanging on by their fingernails. I thought, if you would have asked me in July, I would have said it was going to be a huge year for charcoal rot, which is the dry weather disease that we always worry about. But on the more positive side, where we did have at least enough rain to keep the crop growing, we saw significantly lower levels of foliar diseases. So guys didn't have to invest a lot of money in fungicides to control gray leaf spot because the levels were down. After 2 or 3 years of really significant southern rust problems, there was generally relatively little southern rust this year. So again, people didn't have to worry about scouting about it. They didn't have to worry about going out and put a fungicide on. So there were some positive issues there, but then the drought also brings some negative issues. One of those is that typically nematode pressure is worse under dry conditions. And we did in fact see some very high levels of soybean cyst nematode, particularly coming out of, say, the Great Bend area down in Barton County. We had some really high levels. And in northeast Kansas, in the Donovan, Brown, Atchison County area, root lesion nematode was very severe up there. And so people are thinking about what they're going to do about those problems. Then we get to August, and it rained. And in some respects, it saved the crop, but then it brought its own issues. So one of the more interesting things I saw this year is I was on a crop survey, if you will, going up through the Clay County, Washington County area, and there's a lot of terrace ground up there. And I was noticing that the terraces were really quite green, and then the areas between the terraces had already, we're talking about soybeans, had already started turning yellow and were dropping leaves. And it's kind of interesting because it's the opposite of what we normally see. Normally, we see the terrace tops drying out and maturing first because they're getting charcoal rot in them, and then the rest of the field's looking good. So this was opposite. And kind of upon further investigation, what we see is all that August, early September rain really stirred up Phytophthora root rot in the soybeans. Not to the point that it wiped them out, but it caused them to die prematurely. And so you could guess that you maybe took 5 or 10% off the top of the yields from those fields. We had some interesting samples came in from, I think, the Concordia area, where a fellow had a pivot, and he sent in some plants from the area under the pivot and then from the dryland corners. And from under the pivot, there are basically no secondary roots on it. It was just the main taproot, just a stick. But just crossed over into the dryland area, and the root system was looking fine. And again, we checked those beans, and they were loaded with Phytophthora root rot. And then the other thing late in the season is we, again, saw a lot of ear molds where we had rain at tasseling and reproduction, which a lot of that is out in the western part of the state, atypically this year. We are seeing Fusarium ear rot, some Diplodia ear rot in the drier areas of the state that we talked about earlier, where if the corn did put an ear on and make it, we did have in many fields as high levels of Aspergillus ear rot, the one that produces aflatoxins I've ever seen. I was in fields down east of McPherson. 50% of the ears had Aspergillus colonies in. I was in a field in southern Miami County. Over 70% of the ears had active colonies on. Now, I won't say the good news about this is, but as a follow-up, checking with the testing laboratories in the state that do the mycotoxin testing, while the levels were above the FDA limits for human consumption, which would be 2 parts per million for fumonisin and 20 parts per billion for aflatoxin, all of the cases that I was aware of that they were reporting at the time were below what would be safe to use for cattle feeding, for instance. And so that's one of the things we're concerned about. So if you have aflatoxin and it's 100 parts per billion, it's fine for cattle in the feedlot. If you have corn that has fumonisin levels of 50 parts per billion, that's fine for cattle in the feedlot. Having said that, I believe I was listening to an interview you did recently with the K-State veterinarian, and they indicated that there had been some cases of aflatoxicosis and fumonisin-related deaths in some horses and swine in the state. So, right. We did have some losses, but if you would have asked me earlier in the year, I thought they would be a lot worse. So that's some good news. Just some other diseases of concern. Stalk rots were probably far worse than normal, and that had to do with the weather patterns. Our most common stalk rot, Fusarium stalk rot, likes it wet early, dry in the middle, and the wet on the end, and that's what we had in many places. So we had much above levels of that. Those late season rains then in the soybeans, in addition to the Phytophthora root rot, we had very high levels of frog eye leaf spot. I was in some fields just kind of random surveying that as I looked at it, I said, boy, I hope somebody's out here scouting this field and getting a fungicide out if it hadn't already been applied. And then the last issue, and I think we talked about this in a more recent interview, the seed quality in much of the soybeans was really poor this year. And that's because we have several late-season diseases, pod and stem blight, purple seed stain, and anthracnose primarily, that thrive under very wet conditions, and they're going to cause shrunken, discolored seeds, purple seeds. And there's been quite a bit of dockage going on at the elevators, even some refusal to take them. So, kind of a mishmash of things there. But getting back, you were talking about how is that going to relate to their seed choices?
So there you have an array of diseases prominent in Kansas corn, soybean fields this past growing season. Distilling that down to what producers might want to think about then as they go about their hybrid or variety selection for corn or beans, respectively, the resistance factors that might be available in a hybrid or a variety, what to key on there, your suggestions.
Well, I think it's maybe better to do it disease by disease. So let's just take a look. Phytophthora root rot. There are two types of resistance. There's what we call specific resistance. And when growers look at a seed catalog, they'll have letters like RPS1 or RPSK. That is like true immunity, but the problem is it's pretty specific. And there are probably over 50 different races of Phytophthora potentially in the state. And say that resistance gene you buy might be resistant to 10 of them. Well, if you got one of those 10 in your field, you're good. But if you have one of the other 40, it doesn't help you. So there's more of what we call a field tolerance rating that soybean varieties have. So you would be looking for one that has a very high field tolerance rating. That's not going to protect them 100% from Phytophthora, but it'll protect against significant loss, sort of like hedging in the market. A disease we didn't really talk about today, but it's kind of an average amount this year, soybean sudden death syndrome. You want it. The companies have ratings on that. And it's very clear that you want to choose a variety that's not only high yielding, but has a good SDS rating. And I guess I back up. You always look at the yield first. I mean, that's what it's all about. And then these diseases are secondary characteristics, I would say, to help you narrow it down. Most soybean varieties have SCN resistance in them, but they're not all equal. And so we've always encouraged growers, first of all, to know if you have it or not. And my guess is 90% of the soybean producers in the state really don't know. And so we would encourage soil testing. It's still a good time of year to do that. And the main thing is to never plant the same soybean variety in the same field twice. So pick your varieties, but make sure you're rotating them around through your fields. We get over into the corn. Goss's blight, again, was kind of an average year. I didn't talk about that really, but it's clearly best managed by picking resistant hybrids. So find those good yielding hybrids that will do well in your part of the state, and then look at the Goss's blight rating. Most of these varieties of corn are rated for root strength, stalk strength, and stay green. Those are all characteristics that are highly correlated to stalk rot tolerance. Root lesion nematode in corn, that's a tough one because most of our crops are susceptible to it, so rotation isn't a great option. The seed treatment nematicides haven't worked particularly well, so we're kind of stuck. We don't hardly have the ability to use in-furrow nematicides anymore because our modern planters just don't have insecticide boxes on it because so much is applied to the seed. Sorghum is a good rotation crop where guys are willing to plant it if you have high root lesion nematode problems, but we can try seed treatment nematicide, but it's been kind of inconsistent with the results. But at the very least, you would recommend growers reflect back on this past season, the specific disease troubles they encountered, and act accordingly where they can. Absolutely, because depending on where you live in the state, that was greatly going to affect what problems you had. Do think back on this season, and of course you can find out more information on variety and hybrid resistance to various pathogens out there through your local extension office, or go online to the plant pathology department at K-State or the agronomy department likewise. Doug, we appreciate the time. Thanks so much. You're welcome. Doug Jardine, he's a row crop disease specialist, K-State Research and Extension, and you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here, and we move on now to today's agricultural news headlines for you, these courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the USDA has listed its last weekly crop progress and condition report for the 2018 growing season, and for the week ending December the 2nd here in Kansas, our topsoil moisture supplies at 20% surplus and 76% adequate, only 4% short to very short, and subsoil moisture supplies at 11% surplus, 83% adequate, and 6% short to very short. The winter wheat crop in Kansas is rated now at 45% good to excellent, 39% fair, and 16% poor to very poor. Winter wheat emergence at 89%. As for row crop harvest, still stuck at the same levels as the inclement weather of late has pretty much put harvest at a halt. Corn harvest is 96% complete, soybeans 95% done, sorghum harvest at 89% complete. For December through February, the USDA will issue monthly reports on crop conditions, but that's the last weekly crop progress and condition report for Kansas for the season from the Department of Agriculture. Well, the positive impact of a possible trade truce between the U.S. and China, the one that commodity groups and traders are looking for, was seen Monday as futures prices for soybeans, corn, and wheat all ended the day higher yesterday. President Trump announced over the weekend his administration would hold off on higher tariffs against Chinese goods and that Chinese President Xi Jinping had agreed to immediately lift trade barriers on U.S. products, including agricultural goods. The two countries would begin 90 days of talks on issues such as forced technology transfer, intellectual property protection, non-tariff barriers, and agriculture, according to the White House. If the two countries can't come to terms, the White House states, the president will raise tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese products up to 25%. For now, though, that 10% tariff will remain in place. Now, leadership from the American Soybean Association praised the news. ASA President John Heisdorfer, who's a soybean grower from Iowa, said if this suspension of tariff increases leads to a longer-term agreement, it will be extremely positive for the soy industry. Quoting him, "We want to begin repairing damage done to our trade relations with China, which has been essential to successful soybean exports for years." Still, though China's statement after the G20 meeting was different from the U.S. statement, Chinese officials agreed that the country would buy more U.S. products, but China's statement did not mention that it would immediately restart buying agricultural products as the U.S. had stated. So questions remain about whether commodity purchases from China will pick up. Also, logistically, it could take 30 to 45 days to begin moving products out of export areas such as the Pacific Northwest, meaning that U.S. soybean shipments would still be competing against early soybeans from the South American harvest. It's on now in Agriculture Today to this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to speak with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning feeding grain to calves. You know, there's been a lot of research and a lot of hype and a lot of talk's been given about feeding extra milk to our calves during the liquid feeding period. And often in this discussion, we probably forget to talk about how important grain feeding is during this time as well. With the automatic calf feeders and some other things, we're feeding greater amounts of liquid feed to these baby calves, which has some very important impacts on growth, as well as the health of the smaller calves. However, at some point in time, they do need to be converted over to a ruminant animal, and grain feeding is an important part of that conversion process. One of the things we need to think about is it's going to take about 3 to 4 weeks to essentially convert her from a rumen that is capable of handling just milk to one that is capable of handling grain, and that needs to occur before she is weaned. So let's think about some things a little bit. Most of the time, we wean calves at about 8 to 10 weeks of age. So if we back up 4 weeks, that means that we would be at week 4 of life to maybe week 8 of life that we would be concerned about. If we back up, that means we would be to about week 4 to week 6 of life when we need to be having the animal consume considerable amounts of grain. So what is a considerable amount of grain for the animal to be consuming? Well, if you look at your average weaning date and you back up about 3 weeks, they should be consuming about 1 pound per head per day by that point. If they're not, we might want to consider what we're doing with our milk feeding program. Are we actually feeding a lot more liquid milk than what we need to? In general, animals need somewhere around a minimum of 5 quarts per day, maybe upwards to 6 or 7 quarts. I know some producers will feed 8 quarts or more per day. However, when we start feeding those levels, we generally do reduce the amount of grain that they are consuming. So, if you're on a program that feeds higher levels of milk to the calves early in life, that's fine. It's just you might want to think about cutting that back a little bit so that they actually start consuming grain about 3 weeks before you intend to wean them. And again, that consumption should be about 1 pound per head per day as a minimum. And you might also be thinking about when should you start feeding them forage. Much research has looked at this. If you're going to feed forage, it needs to be very digestible. Some either very good alfalfa or a very good grass hay will also work in place of the alfalfa. But how much do you need to feed and when? Well, that really maybe needs to be determined by the grain consumption. Generally, by the time the animals are consuming about 4 to 5 pounds of grain per day, it's probably important to have some longer stem fiber available to them. Prior to that, it may not be as important, and research is varied as to whether or not there's an advantage to feeding forage earlier rather than a little bit later. But in general, keep in mind that we need to develop the rumen, and the one important factor in developing the rumen in these young calves is grain feeding. So you might want to take a look at your grain feeding program in your calves today, making sure that we're getting adequate consumption of grain prior to weaning. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike, and this is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
For you now on this Agriculture Today, our weekly visit with Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, we're going to return to a topic which is still prominent here in the state of Kansas and other livestock states. The problem with starlings hovering around and causing troubles around livestock feeding facilities. This will be based on new research on this topic, but this issue just won't go away.
European starlings are an invasive bird species in North America that certainly cause damage to livestock feeding facilities and dairies through the consumption of part of the ration. Starlings have been very successful at colonizing. They've established populations on each continent except Antarctica. They seasonally congregate in these large roosting groups and exploit the abundant and nutritious food resources that are found on livestock feeding facilities. They've been documented consuming livestock feed in the United States, Europe, Australia, and it can cause significant damage to feedlots and dairies here in the United States. Some early studies in Wisconsin, New York, and Pennsylvania suggested that starling damage results in about $64,000 of feed loss annually in those dairies that have 10,000 or more birds per day, and feed costs have increased 42% in dairies with more than 10,000 birds per day.
That's substantial.
So feed consumption is certainly going to impact animal performance, and it's going to cause some lack of production. And that was the focus of this research trial.
Give us the details on this trial. It got right at, eventually, at the actual impact on dairy cow nutrition. But how do you get from point A to point B there?
Well, starlings were live trapped from a commercial dairy using mist nets and modified Australian crow traps. Then they were transported to the National Wildlife Research Center in Fort Collins, Colorado for feeding and the experiments. The nutrition experiments were conducted and particle size testing has been conducted since 2016. The starlings were quarantined, went through all of the quarantine requirements, and then they were set up on a pretest that lasted for 5 days. Then the birds were within each cage then were fed a known amount as fed of the total mixed ration that was supplied to dairy herd. And then the total mixed ration that was offered was a late lactation ration that was fed to milk-producing cows. Then the rations were analyzed after starlings had fed on them for a nutritional analysis, and then they separated the rations out into the various 7 ration components that included steam-flaked corn, and then there was an energy nugget to provide metabolizable energy. There was also some dry distiller's grain, canola meal, and corn silage and a mineral supplement. Those were all partitioned out and fed in separate trials to starlings to see if starlings would consume those particular products.
And did starlings have a preference among those alternatives then?
They certainly did. They primarily selected the energy nugget, which was the highest price portion of the ration, and that was the one primarily selected among the 7 components. 49% of their total diet was of that energy nugget. But when the energy nugget was removed from the ration and starlings had then switched to feeding on the steam-flaked corn of the ration, their consumption was almost doubled what it was when they had access just to the energy ration. So starlings don't need as much when they're eating high-energy feed. When the high-energy component is removed, then they start feeding on some of the other nutritional components that are not as beneficial to starlings or to livestock.
So they are taking in a substantial amount of feed and specific kinds of feedstuffs within that ration, and that then translates into a negative impact on cattle feed consumption and performance?
Yeah, they did some modeling and looking at dairy production, and when you take out the amount of energy that was consumed by the starlings, Holsteins then would be potentially use 1 body condition score in 91 days when the energy components were removed, where normally they would only lose 1 body condition score in 161 days. They also experienced 2 times the weight loss per day when the energy component was removed from the ration. So it certainly is going to then result in less milk production. Commercial dairies are operating on a pretty thin margin, right. And when those rations are altered, they're certainly not getting the production that they'd hoped for.
Is there a solution? Well, this research proposes a possible change in the ration that could not appeal as well to starlings, to put it that way.
Well, one of the things that can be done, which has been tried in other locations as well, is to increase the diameter of the pellet size on those concentrated energy components. This particular study said that pellets that were greater than 3/8-inch diameter inhibited starling consumption by more than 79%. Other studies have said that you needed to increase the size of that pellet to approximately a 1/2-inch diameter or even 1 inch in diameter. But this particular research said we could still go down as small as 3/8-inch diameter pellet, and that's going to inhibit starling consumption tremendously.
So you think that is probably a solid answer to the problem?
Well, I don't know that that's a complete answer. That may address the problems with starlings altering the ration as presented, but there are still other problems associated with birds at livestock facilities. Some of those are contamination, the E. coli issue, the increased cost and cleaning associated with removing these highly acidic bird droppings. So I think there are other issues, but it looks like perhaps we have some ways to reduce the highest cost components of the ration and make those less attractive to starlings.
Once more, this study was conducted by the USDA in cooperation with Colorado State University, and they were looking at starlings as they would dine, if you will, on livestock feed out of bunks, and what, if anything, could be done about that. Charlie, much obliged. Charlie Lee with us, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. That's our time for today. We appreciate you tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.